This video will cover the exercises from 1.7. The first one is 1.7.4, which is casting to an int. So what we need to do is ask the user for a double variable, which we're going to then store. Well, this is kind of worded strangely. We're going to ask the user for a double value, which we're going to store in a variable called myDouble. So basically, they're going to be giving us a decimal value, and we're going to store it into a variable of this name. Then we're going to go ahead and cast that double into an int and then print out the int value to screen. All right, so I'm going to actually copy these steps so I can put them as comments here. Let me go ahead and start this over. All right, so first step, I'm going to reword that first step so that it makes a little bit more sense. First step will be to ask the user for a decimal value, a double value. I'll just put decimal. Okay, let's check to see if they are expecting us to use a particular prompt. They don't have any given there, so I don't think it matters. So let's go ahead and just put in our prompt here, system.out.println. So I'll just put enter a double value. All right, but now because I am expecting user input, I actually need to create a scanner object. So before I even prompt the user, my first step that they didn't actually acknowledge is I need to create a scanner object. So we'll do that here. Notice that they've already imported the scanner class for us, so that's what enables us to do this. So we're going to say scanner, and then we're going to name our scanner, and input is always a good name. And then we're going to instantiate our object by calling the constructor. So that is new scanner, and then we always pass it system.in. Okay, so now we have that scanner object to now get the value that the user is going to be inputting. So actually there's an extra step here as well. We need to store the value from user input as a double, and they actually give us the name that they want us to use. So it should be called myDouble as a double named myDouble. All right, cool. So to do that, we're just going to say double and then use the name myDouble. And then what we're going to do is we're going to initialize this variable as the value that the user inputted. And to get that value from user input, we need to use our scanner object. So on our scanner object, we're going to call the method nextDouble to get the value from the input. All right, so now we're storing that. But the next thing we want to do is we want to cast this double value into an int. So in order to do that, we actually need to create a new variable of int type, and we can call this myInt. And what we want to do is we want to use casting. So to do casting, we just put the type that we want inside of parentheses, and then the variable to cast to that type. So I would put myDouble, and that would cast whatever value I have in here as an integer, which technically was just going to delete the decimal point number and everything to the right of that number. So it would be the whole number portion. The last thing we then want to do is print this integer value. So that's just a simple print statement, system.out.println, and then myInt. So now we'll go ahead and test this out, run the code. We can put in any double value we want, and we should get just the whole number version back. There we see it. So if we click check code, it will test a variety of different values, and you'll see that it'll pass all the tests. All right, the next one is casting to a double. So we just casted to an int, now we're going to cast to a double. For this one, we are also going to use a scanner object in order to ask the user for two integers that we're going to store into variables called int1 and int2. Then we are going to divide the two integers, and then we're going to print the result. Okay, but the trick here is that in step 2, we're not going to do double division. We want the division to result in a double. So we're going to have to cast at least one of these integers as a double in order to get the result as a double and not as integer division. All right, so once again, I'm going to copy these steps and we're going to alter these steps a little bit to break down the problem a little further and make it a little clearer. So they said we need to ask the user for two integers, and they told us what to name them rather, divide the two ints, and then print the results. But let's add some more steps in here. So first, we actually need to create our scanner object, create the scanner object. Then we need to ask the user for two integers. Then we're going to store the values from user input to int variables named. Let me go ahead and put this on a new line so it's not all crowded. So let me break these up. And then what we want to do is we want to divide the two integers, but we want a double as a result. So what we want to do is we want to divide the two ints while casting at least one. You could cast both, but it just needs to be one of these variables as a double. And then we want to store the result as a double. And they don't tell us what to name it, so we can name it whatever we want. And then finally, we want to print the results. All right, so let's start with the first step, which is just to create our scanner object. I always like to call it input because that makes sense. And then I'm going to call the constructor, which we always want to pass in system in as our argument. All right, so now that we have that, we can now prompt our user. So system.out.println, and we'll just say enter two integers. And now we actually want to get those integers from user input and store them into two variables named int1 and int2. So for the first one, we'll declare int and then name it int1. And how do we get the value from user input? Well, we're going to call a method on our scanner object, which is called input. So the method we want to call is going to be nextInt because we want an integer value from the user input. So we're going to actually call this a second time to get the second value that the user put in there, and this time we're going to store that value to int2. Now, here's the tricky part where we want to divide the two ints, and the reason why it's tricky is if we were to say int1 divided by int2, that is technically, integer division, which would result in an integer. But we want our expression to result in a double, not an integer. Okay, so what we want to do is cast one of these as a double. So if we cast one of these as a double, this is no longer integer division, and we will get a double as a result. So we do want to store this. So let's go ahead and declare a variable of double type, and we'll just call it my double. And we'll use the assignment operator to store the result of this expression to this variable. And then don't forget your semicolon. And for our final step, we'll go ahead and print out the value that it got stored into my double. So that's our print statement. with my double passed into the print statement. So now we can go ahead and test this out, run the code, and we can put in any two whole numbers. So let's put 5 and 22. And now what it's going to do is it's actually going to cast that first integer here as a double. So this is now going to be encoded as 5.0, and it's going to divide that number by 22 and give us the double, the decimal point value instead of the whole number back. So we can go ahead and check this against the tests provided, and we clear all of those tests. The next one is called movie ratings. So in movie ratings, we've got this scenario where movies always come with ratings. A bad movie may have 1.4 stars, and a great movie may have 4.9 stars. So your job is to write a program that asks the user for a movie rating as a double, so again using user input, which means scanner object, and then rounds to the nearest int using the rounding with casting technique. For example, a run of your program may look like this. So a person puts in 1.4, and then we print to screen the rounded version. So this gets rounded down to 1, and we want to actually round up if it has a decimal value of 0.5 or higher. All right, so let's go ahead and proceed. So first thing we want to do is we want to create a scanner object. Okay, so we'll do that just as we did in the previous two. So scanner it, and then call it input, call the constructor, and pass in system.in. All right, now we want to prompt the user for a movie rating. Okay, so system.out.println, enter a movie rating, and remember they can put in a double value. So we actually want to store this result as this input as a double. So our next step is to store user input as a double. So we can go ahead and call this variable rating. And in order to grab that double value, we need to call a method on our scanner object, which is named input. And the name of the method we need to call is next double, because that's the data type we're looking for. All right, so next thing we want to do is we want to round the rating to the nearest whole number, nearest integer. Okay, so one thing we could do, well, one step of this is to cast the rating value. So let's say, let's call this rounded rating. So we want an integer back, so we're gonna declare this new variable as an int type. So what we could do is we could just simply cast rating, but this doesn't do exactly what we want because it turns out that casting always rounds down. But we want to round up if we have a decimal component of 0.5 or higher. So what we actually want to do is we would like to, in order to account for that, actually add on 0.5 to rating first. That way, if it's closer to the next whole number, the whole number component will then become that. So say like you have 3.5, like rating is 3.5. If you add 0.5 to it, that then becomes 4. So then when we cast it, it's going to become 4. And the same thing if it's 3.7, then that will become 4.2, which will then, when you cast this as an integer, will become 4, which is exactly what we want to happen, is we want to round it up. So now we finally want to print out this result. So rounded rating. And later on, you will see a method that actually rounds things correctly, but they just kind of want you to think of this as a puzzle to solve with the tools that you have currently. So let's go ahead and run this code, and we will test out, let's test out 3.7. And so we get 4 back, and then we can test out a number that should not get rounded up, like 1.2 should be 1, and we get 1 back. Then we can check the code, so it'll test a variety of numbers, and all of those work. All right, final question is integer overflow. So integer overflow. If an expression would evaluate to an int value outside of the allowed range, then integer overflow occurs. So remember, there is a minimum and a maximum value that the integer type can encode because of its limit of 32 bits in memory. So anyways, when you exceed that amount, it's called overflow, and when you try to go below the value, the lowest possible value, it's called underflow. All right, when that happens, what happens is that you get an incorrect value back within the allowed range because it circles back. So if you try to go too high, it'll actually go back to the lowest value. If you try to go too low, it'll go back to the highest value. So this exercise actually illustrates this. So in this program, you're going to test for underflow, and you're going to test for overflow in Java by adding 1 to the maximum value and subtracting 1 from the minimum value to see what happens to the output. So our output should include 4 items. First, we're going to print out the minimum value for an integer, then the maximum, and then we're going to print out the minimum value subtracted by 1 to see what happens when underflow happens. And then the last example will be printing out the maximum value with 1 added, which is what overflow is. All right, so let's go back to the problem. And so what we want to do is just declare those variables. Or actually, we don't even need to declare the first one, actually. We could just do system.out.print. And in Java, we actually have, so we have the primitive types, which are just int. And so that's the primitive type. So that's a primitive. But every primitive also has a class version, which is uppercase. So integer is the class version. So in our integer class, there is a constant variable called max value, and there's a constant value called min value. So in order to actually get those, we could just put the name of the class, integer, and then dot, and then the name of the constant, the variable. So max value is 1. And I think that's the first one we wanted to print in our list here. So, oh, actually it's the minimum and then the maximum. So let's go ahead and put min value. So I'm going to go ahead and put our requirements here. Print out the minimum integer value. Next thing is to print out the maximum integer value. So now we're going to get the max value. Next thing I think was the underflow. So we want to print out the minimum value by subtracted by 1. Print out the min integer value subtracted by 1, and this should be illustrating underflow, where it's going to circle back to the maximum possible value because it can't go lower than it already has. So in order to do that, I'm going to copy this line right here and simply put -1. So it's going to take the minimum value and it's going to subtract 1, and then it'll print out the result of that statement. And the next part is going to be to print out the max integer value increased by 1. Print out the max integer value increased by 1, or incremented by 1. This is going to illustrate overflow. What happens when we exceed the max possible value is that we're going to circle back to the minimum, the lowest possible value. Illustrates overflow. Okay, so I'll go ahead and copy actually this line right here, and I'll just put +1. So that's the max value +1. So what we should see is a really big negative number, and then a really big maximum or positive value. And then here we would expect to see a really big negative number, but it's actually going to be the same value here because it's going to circle back. And then what we'd expect is to see a really large positive number here, but we're actually going to see the min value again because it's going to circle back to that lower number. So if I go ahead and run this code, you'll see that phenomenon happening here. So here's our minimum, here's our maximum. Here's what happens when we try to decrease our minimum by 1. We wind up getting our maximum because it's like a cycle. And then here's what happens when we try to subtract add 1 to our max value. We circle back to the lowest possible value, which is the same as our min. So this is just illustrating the concept of integer overflow and underflow.